Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories.
It was a crisp autumn evening when Michael and Sarah decided to hike through the woods near their cabin. They had always enjoyed nature, the quiet peace it offered. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail, but they weren't worried. They'd walked this path countless times. The forest had a feeling about it that night. The air seemed thicker, heavier. The rustling leaves sounded like whispers, though there was no wind. Michael shrugged it off as nerves, but Sarah, who was usually the more rational one, felt uneasy. "Let's take the shortcut," Michael suggested, pointing to a narrow trail veering off the main path. It was a well-known shortcut, but something about it felt different tonight. Sarah hesitated but agreed, not wanting to seem overly cautious. As they ventured deeper, the trees grew denser, blocking out what little light remained. The whispers grew louder, but not in a way that made sense. It wasn't the sound of the wind, but something else. Sarah looked at Michael, trying to laugh off the feeling of being watched. "You hear that, right?" she asked. "Probably just some animals," Michael said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. They pushed forward, the atmosphere around them growing thicker, colder. Then Sarah froze. "Did you see that?" Her voice was low, a whisper of its own. Michael stopped, scanning the darkness ahead. There was nothing, just the twisted trunks of trees and the flickering of shadows. "I didn't see anything." But the feeling didn't go away. It felt as though something was moving just out of sight, following them. Sarah's heart started to race. She grabbed Michael's arm, her grip tightening. "Michael, we need to leave. Now." He pulled away, trying to brush it off. "Calm down, it's just your imagination." But before he could take another step, a faint sound echoed through the trees, a deep, guttural growl that didn't belong to any animal they knew. The growl wasn't distant, it was close. Too close. Michael's face turned pale. What the hell was that? Before he could react, a figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the darkness. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, with long, ragged clothes that blended with the trees. It was a shadow, impossible to make out, but its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly like 2 tiny embers. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Run!" she screamed, her voice breaking as the figure took a step toward them. They both turned and bolted, but the forest seemed to close in on them, twisting and shifting. The path they knew so well was now a maze of impossible angles, each turn leading them deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder, now filling their minds, urging them forward. A chilling realization gripped Sarah's heart. They weren't alone. They never had been. Something was hunting them. But they couldn't outrun it because it was the forest itself, and the forest didn't let anyone leave. As they ran, the figure followed them, its footsteps slow but relentless. Every time they thought they saw the way out, the trees would shift again, closing off their escape. The forest knew them, and it wasn't letting them go. Michael and Sarah stumbled through the underbrush, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows around them deepened, swallowing the faint light that had been left behind by the fading moon. Every sound seemed amplified, from the crunch of leaves underfoot to the eerie whispers that seemed to slither through the trees like some invisible force, wrapping around their minds. "Why isn't the trail ahead familiar?" Sarah gasped. The landscape was wrong, twisted. She had hiked these woods for years, and yet the ground seemed foreign now, the trees leaning in at odd angles, the path narrowing in on them, pushing them further into the forest's suffocating grasp. Michael didn't respond. His gaze was fixed ahead, where he thought he saw a flicker of light, a faint glimmer of hope, perhaps. "This way," he called out, urging Sarah to follow. But his voice wavered, uncertain, as though even he didn't believe the words he was saying. They pushed forward, but with every step, the woods seemed to stretch on endlessly. The light from the moon above, once soft and comforting, was now lost behind layers of dense branches, leaving them in an unnatural darkness. Then the growl came again, closer this time. Sarah's blood ran cold. The creature was near. Her heart raced as she glanced behind them, but all she saw was the deep blackness, an endless void that seemed to watch and wait. "Michael," she started, but her words caught in her throat. He was no longer beside her. Panic surged through her as she whirled around, eyes scanning the forest frantically. He had stopped, standing in the middle of the path, staring ahead with wide, unblinking eyes. "Michael!" Sarah shouted, running back to him. But when she reached his side, he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance that Sarah couldn't see. "Michael, we have to go," she cried, pulling at his arm. But it was as if he couldn't hear her, or worse, didn't care. That's when she saw it. Just beyond Michael, nestled between the gnarled trees, a figure stepped forward. The same one from before, tall and hauntingly still, its form now clearer in the dim light. The figure's eyes, those burning embers, fixed on her. The whispers grew louder, now a chant that filled her head, reverberating through her skull. Leave him." Her body froze. The words weren't spoken, but they were felt. They were a command, cold and inevitable. Sarah knew she had to run. She knew she couldn't stay, but she couldn't leave Michael either. The creature, if it was even a creature, was holding him there, paralyzed in place. She reached out for him, her hand trembling. "Michael, please come back to me." But Michael didn't respond. His eyes were glazed over, as though he were in a trance, listening to the whispers of the forest itself. Then the figure moved. Slow, deliberate. Its long limbs stretched out like branches, and in a flash, it was standing beside Michael, its form now towering over him. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized she was no longer just witnessing this thing, it was part of the forest, part of the land they were trespassing on. This wasn't an ordinary creature. It was something older, more ancient, something that had existed long before their time. The creature's cold hand reached down, brushing Michael's cheek. He shuddered but didn't resist. "You are mine now," the voice, if it could be called a voice, echoed in Sarah's mind. In that moment, Sarah understood. The forest wasn't just alive, it was a hunter, and they were its prey. And Michael? He was already lost to it. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't fight it, not physically, but there had to be another way. There had to be a way to free Michael, to escape this nightmare. With one last glance at the creature, Sarah turned and fled, her steps quickening, heart pounding with fear and desperation. But the forest was closing in on her. The trees seemed to reach for her, their branches twisting, pulling, trying to drag her back into the shadows. The whispers followed, relentless and cold. "You cannot leave." And then she heard a voice, Michael's voice, faint and distant, calling her name, barely a whisper but unmistakable. "Sarah." Her heart lurched. Could it be him? Or was it another trick of the forest? She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered was escaping. She had to make it out, or she would become part of the forest like so many others before her. But as the forest whispered and howled around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it claimed her too. Sarah ran blindly, her feet stumbling over roots and rocks, her breath ragged in her chest. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside her mind now, weaving their way through her thoughts, growing louder with each passing second. The forest was closing in, squeezing the life from her, and it felt like the trees themselves were watching, waiting for her to falter. "Leave." It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, an overwhelming force pushing at the edges of her mind. Sarah tried to block it out, tried to focus on the path ahead, but the darkness was oppressive, and she could barely see through the thick veil of night. Her limbs were heavy, exhausted, her body screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. The sound of crunching leaves echoed behind her. It was distant at first, but it grew steadily closer. She wasn't alone. "You cannot escape." The voice again, louder this time, colder, as if the very trees themselves were speaking. Her heart raced. She knew the creature was still out there watching her, but she didn't dare look back. It would catch her if she did. It had already claimed Michael. What made her think she could escape its grasp? Her legs began to ache, her energy waning, but she pushed forward, knowing that if she stopped even for a second she would be lost forever. The path twisted, the trees bent and shifted, their trunks leaning toward her like a maze that had been designed to trap her. Then through the oppressive darkness, a faint light appeared. It wasn't much, a small glimmer, but it was enough. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the glow. It was the cabin. Their cabin. She had found her way back. But there was no comfort in this sight. The cabin looked wrong. The windows were dark, lifeless, as though it had been abandoned for years. The warm, inviting glow of a safe haven was now replaced with an eerie, unnatural stillness. Her feet carried her forward anyway, as if drawn by some invisible force. She reached the porch and fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, impossible. She had never locked it before when they went hiking. Her hand shook as she pulled at the knob again, panic rising in her chest. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, drawing closer. She spun around, but there was no one. Nothing. The woods were silent once again. "Let me in." The voice was inside her head now, a whisper that burned her very thoughts. She knew she had to get inside the cabin. She had to find shelter before it was too late. With one final, desperate attempt, Sarah slammed her shoulder against the door. The wood groaned but didn't give. She pulled back, her heart hammering, and tried again. This time the door creaked open just a few inches. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her with a trembling hand. The darkness of the cabin wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with dust, and the once familiar smell of pine and wood was now stale, cloying. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and turned toward the living room. The faint light she had seen outside came from the fireplace. It was flickering, a low orange glow casting long shadows on the walls. And then she saw it. Michael. He was sitting by the fire, his back turned to her. His shoulders were hunched, his hands resting on his knees. But he wasn't the same. His face, when he turned slightly, was pale, hollow. His eyes were wide and vacant, and the glimmer she had seen in them earlier was gone, replaced by a deep emptiness. "Michael." Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. He didn't respond. He just sat there, unmoving. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice whispered again, and this time, Sarah knew it wasn't just in her mind. It was the forest, reaching out from the shadows, invading the cabin, filling the room with its presence. Sarah stepped closer, her fear growing. "Michael, please. We need to leave this place." But as she reached for him, he stood, his movements jerky, unnatural. His eyes locked onto hers, but they weren't his eyes. They were cold, empty. "It's too late for him," the voice echoed, dark and final. Suddenly, Michael took a step toward her. His feet dragged on the floor, and the sound was sickeningly slow, as though the very air was thickening around him. "No!" Sarah screamed, stumbling backward. She didn't know what to do. How could she fight this? How could she save him? But Michael didn't stop. He kept coming, his expression blank, his movements mechanical. The door behind her slammed shut. Trap. The forest had found its way inside. And now it was going to take everything. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed into the corner of the cabin, her eyes wide with terror. Michael was getting closer, his footsteps dragging as though the forest itself was pulling him toward her, like a puppet on a string. His eyes, those empty, vacant eyes, stared at her with an unblinking intensity, and the air grew colder with each passing second. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to take a step. The whispers, those haunting voices, filled the cabin, echoing through the walls, curling around her mind. "You cannot escape," they chanted over and over. But something in Sarah stirred, a desperate, primal urge to fight. She wasn't ready to lose him, not like this. There had to be a way. Her eyes scanned the room, desperate for anything that could help. Her gaze fell on the fireplace, the small, flickering flames dancing wildly. And then it hit her. The forest wasn't just outside, it was inside her head, controlling everything around them. If she could fight its hold on Michael, she might be able to break free. She rushed to the fireplace, her breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. The fire was weak, but it was still there. She grabbed a piece of firewood, her hands shaking, and threw it onto the flames. The fire grew, its warmth spreading, its light brighter and more intense. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest could sense her defiance. You cannot fight it. You cannot win. But Sarah didn't listen. She grabbed another log, her hands trembling with determination, and threw it into the fire. The flames leaped higher, their light casting long shadows across the room, and she knew that the forest's power was rooted in the dark, in the silence. The fire, the light, was the only thing that could drive it back. Michael, she shouted, her voice raw. Fight it. You're stronger than this. Michael's movements faltered for a moment, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But then the forest's grip tightened, and his gaze returned to that cold emptiness. He took another step toward her, the air growing more suffocating, more oppressive with every breath she took. But Sarah didn't stop. She gathered every ounce of strength, every bit of willpower she had left, and threw one last log into the fire. The flames roared to life, filling the room with a blinding light, and for a moment the whispers ceased. The air grew still. Then everything went quiet. For a fleeting moment, Sarah thought she had won. She thought the forest had finally been driven back. But then she heard it, the faintest rustle behind her. She spun around, her heart in her throat, and there he was again. Michael. But this time his eyes weren't empty. They were his eyes. The warmth returned to his face, the hollow emptiness replaced with recognition. He took a step toward her, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah? Tears welled in her eyes as she collapsed into his arms, holding him tightly, afraid to let go. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since they had entered the woods, she felt the weight of the forest begin to lift. The presence, the suffocating grip that had haunted them, was fading. The fire crackled behind them, its warmth growing as the room began to fill with light. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the cracks in the cabin, Sarah knew they had made it out. They had survived. But as they stood there, the forest now quiet outside, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching. That the forest was patient, waiting for the next unwitting soul to wander too close. And when they did, it would be ready to take them. The forest never truly let go. Just waited.